The unknown man told Roland to begin. After that, the little boy began to use the spell. The man thought that if he regularly gave him large doses of the magic power stimulant, the chances of the transformation experiment succeeding would increase. At this point, the man asked Melissa to hand the bottle to Holland. He said it was a potion, so it wouldn't taste good and the guy should suck it up and drink it. The protagonist realized that the vial contained a stimulant of magical power. She wondered when Renka had started giving it to Roland. According to the story, if he continued to take it from that day on, Roland's veins would be filled with inhuman blood, and the dark blue liquid that replaced it would be a stimulant of magical power. The protagonist realized that the day had come. She realized that if that was true, something bad was about to happen. At that moment, Karina rushed towards the boy, trying to wrestle the vial from him. She then fell and crashed, scaring the children. This is the moment the man turned to the protagonist and asked what it was. Karina apologized, but Renka told her that if she interrupted his experiment like that again, he would cut off her arm or leg. He asked if she understood him. The main character said she did and apologized. Renka said he's completely useless and they're done for the day. After a while in the kids' room, Melissa asked the main character what if she got punished because of them. But the main character told the children not to worry and that everything would be all right. She asked if they were okay and if they had hurt themselves. The kids all said at the same time that everything was fine. Karina patted them on the head and said that she was Rada then. Karina said that now they should rest a little. After that, she said she was leaving. But at that moment, Roland stopped her and asked her to stay with them a little longer. But at that point, he let the girl go and said it didn't matter. He said he knew she was busy and they shouldn't bother her. Karina realized that this was the first time Roland had spoken to her. She realized that he must have been really afraid of what had happened. She realized that she couldn't go on like this. At this point, the main character started to leave and told the children to wait for her for a while. Knowing that Renka was giving the boy a stimulant, the protagonist couldn't let it go on. She realized that she had to get the children away somehow. She thought they didn't belong in this hell. She thought the little ones shouldn't have to suffer anymore. In the story she got into, the main character Roland and his sister Melissa. They are the children of Renka's younger sister. They were sent to an orphanage after her death. After a while, Renka took his nephew in. He went along with it because Roland and Melissa have a magical gift, especially Roland. Unfortunately for him, he was born with an extraordinary talent. Having obtained this boy, Renka had great ambitions to gain power over the world. For this purpose, he decided to make Roland an archmage. But he resisted, and then Renka began to punish Melissa for his mistakes. These punishments were monstrously cruel. The poor girl died after only a few years. Roland was not even allowed to mourn his sister, for his training in magic was not about to end. Years later, he became the strongest archmage of his time, so strong that he once single-handedly averted a catastrophe that threatened to destroy the entire empire. Having gained such power, Roland laid together and soon brutally murdered Renka. But even after killing his uncle, he never stopped blaming himself for the fox's death. His life was forever poisoned by endless pain and despair. This is the story told in a book that the protagonist read in a past life. She could only think of one thing when she was immersed in the story. The protagonist didn't realize whether these poor children deserved such a fate. She thought that if someone cared about Roland and Melissa, their fate wouldn't have been so terrible. When the protagonist was unexpectedly reborn in this story, she had already forgotten most of it. That's not surprising, though. It was just one of the many fantasy books on her bookshelf. But Karina didn't think it mattered because seeing the smiles of those children, when she heard them calling her, she suddenly realized clearly that she had come into this world to make them happy. After accepting her role, the protagonist began to plan her escape from the estate. She realized that everything needed to be prepared so that they could escape at the first opportunity. In her reports to the Renka, she overstated food and living expenses, and the funds so concealed were saved for their escape. The capital of Edmore is one of the most densely populated and distant from the estate Renka cities, ideal for them. Karina realized that after much preparation, everything was finally ready and they could escape. She wondered if they had no other options. Karina took the money and left the room. She knew that Renka usually slept from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. That meant they only had 3 hours. Only at this time, his magical minions aren't prowling around. The protagonist has already spent 2 hours packing. Now they have 1 hour to spare. In that time, they need to leave the manor. Karina realized that time was short, but they would manage if everything went according to plan. Karina realized that no one must find out, because if they were caught, they would be in great danger. The protagonist then knocked on the children's room and asked if she could come in. Roland asked if they had extra training. She said they would get together right away. He said his uncle hates to wait. But Karina smiled at the boy and said there was no need to worry as they wouldn't go to him. Melissa asked if she came to play with them. She asked if her uncle allowed it. Roland asked if it was true. He asked if they were really going to play. Karina felt sad because she realized that they were just children who lacked love and care. At this point, she said she knew a good place and suggested we all run away from here together. Right now. She said that Renka would want to repeat the experiment of changing the human body with magic. Melissa asked if they would be scolded and punished again. But the protagonist said she wanted to leave the place early. Melissa said they would go with her. But Roland said his uncle wouldn't let them just leave. But Karina said she had an idea. She asked the kids if they'd ever made a homunculus. She told them not to worry because she wouldn't scold them. She said it would come in handy to get away from here. She offered to tell them what she'd come up with. Children can only leave the manor if they are accompanied by an uncle. The protagonist's plan is to get around this by using a homunculus, a person artificially created by a magician. This creation is what will help them escape. If the mage doesn't concentrate fully during the ritual, the creation process will go wrong. A mistake can even cost the mage his life, so the creation of homunculi is forbidden. But the protagonist knew what these children had already created and freely controlled one. She thought it was because Roland was a potential archmage and had great magical power. Karina told the children that if they created a homunculus like their uncle, they could escape. She asked if they could do it, but she realized that Roland was afraid to use magic. Roland told the girl that since she asked he would try it, but he said he was afraid. But Melissa said if the protagonist is sure her plan will work, they'll try. But she said they definitely could. The protagonist was pleased that Melissa was enthusiastic about magic. At that moment, Roland hugged his sister and said he wasn't afraid if they did it together. Melissa told her brother that it would be okay because they had done it last time. Karina told the children to make a homunculus and she would speak for Renka. She realized that now was not the time to be sentimental. The main character told the kids they didn't have much time and asked if they would start. Melissa asked her brother if he was ready. Roland said yes. At that moment, they summoned a homunculus with an exact resemblance to their uncle. Karina realized that he looked exactly like Renka, and few people would notice the difference. At that moment, Melissa hugged her brother and said that they had done it right the first time. Roland also praised his sister. Afterwards, the main character patted the kids and said they were both doing great. With joy on her face, the protagonist said she had to get out of here as soon as possible. She said that Renka was asleep, so now was the best time to escape. After that, they started to leave, but at that moment a butler stood in their way. Karina calmed herself down and said that everything was fine, and the butler would not notice anything if she could manage her role. At that moment, the butler asked the man if he was leaving, but the homunculus simply remained silent. The butler told the man that if he told him where he was going, he would order a carriage. But at that moment, the protagonist stood in front of the homunculus and said that Lord Rank couldn't speak right now because of a side effect of one spell. She said they were going into the forest to gather herbs that would help him speak again. She asked the butler if he wanted the man to stand there forever. She said that the side effects were not to be trifled with and would only get worse over time. The butler got scared and said he understood. He said the carriage would be waiting for them in the backyard. After that, they walked past the butler as if nothing had happened, and the protagonist was glad that they had managed it. She realized that the butler didn't suspect anything, but she couldn't let her guard down. As long as you're not in town, the danger isn't going anywhere. When they got to the carriage, the main character told the children that the family crest on the carriage was too conspicuous and it might give them away, so they would have to walk. She said she knew it was going to be hard, but said she would have to do some legwork now. Roland asked if that was really necessary. He said it was faster on the carriage. But Karina told the children that as soon as they arrived at the place, they would find the fastest carriage that would bring them to the other town in no time. At that moment, the homunculus began to disintegrate. Roland said the homunculus's time was up and it was disappearing. The protagonist confirmed this and said that's why they had to hurry. She knew that Renka had an hour of sleep left when they escaped and he was probably already awake. Karina told the children to hold her hands tightly because they mustn't get lost. After that, they all arrived in the city together. The protagonist approached the man and asked where she could find a carriage to Edmure, and one that would leave right away. But the man said there was no such thing today. The protagonist wanted to ask something, but at that moment Melissa translated her and asked her to look. When Karina looked around, she saw one of the Renke's minions. She realized that he had already noticed their disappearance and had sent his servants after them. Karina realized that they had to run away as soon as possible. She asked the man where the carriage that was leaving now was going. The man said he was in Taurus. The protagonist said it suited them. The man then asked if she had said Edmure. Karina thanked him and said that they were in a hurry. The man agreed and said there was no problem, but he said there were no seats on this crew, so they'd have to ride in the boot. The protagonist rejoiced and thanked the man. As they sat in the carriage, Karina told the children that they would be leaving the city soon, so they could take a breather. Melissa asked cheerfully if Uncle wouldn't catch them. Roland asked if he wouldn't make them do any more sorcery. Karina smiled at the children and said no more. She realized that everything was over and the children would be able to live their lives happily. As in the story, Roland told his sister that they no longer had to fear being scolded. The protagonist realized that in their haste, they had got on the first carriage they could find. At this point, The protagonist realized that she thought she'd seen this title in the original book. At that moment, the carriage announced that they were traveling beyond the city limits. There is a man who could interfere with Roland's new life. Duke Claude Thors, known for recruiting talented people on the principle that the end justifies the means. Because of this obsession, he's been nicknamed the talent fanatic. Archimagus Roland was one of those whom the Duke wanted to slaughter, but the latter rejected all his offers. After endless refusals, Claude harbored a grudge against Roland, and from then on, wherever Roland was, Duke Thors would appear there and try to impose a fight on him, leaving behind sheer devastation. This went on for decades. Karina remembered that people even standing became afraid to approach Roland for fear of conflict with the Duke. For this reason, Roland's life was spent in complete solitude. Although he dreamed of something else, Karina realized that if Torres noticed Roland's talent, it would interfere with his dreams of a happy life. When they arrived, Melissa told the main character to see how much fun there was here. Roland said that it also smelled very good here. Karina was pleased and laughed. She realized that the children had plenty of energy even after a long journey. She was glad they'd made it to Torres without any problems, but living here they'd spend more money than she'd planned. And the protagonist feared that the situation in the capital would be much worse than she imagined. She realized that if they went to Edmure, she would have to live on the streets. In history, the first meeting between Duke Toros and Roland took place much later in the day. In addition, the Duke was interested in Roland, who had already become an archmage. The protagonist thought he had no use for an 8-year-old boy. Karina decided that she needed to find a job and save money to go to Edmure. She felt she had no other options. At this point, the protagonist sat down and told the children that she thought they should stay here for a while. Roland asked if they were not going to Edmure, but the main character patted the kids on the head and said she was afraid she wasn't. She said they didn't have enough money to go there right now. She said that's why she wanted to stay here to earn money. She asked the children what they would say to that. She asked if she had a good idea. The kids smiled and said okay. But when the protagonist came to the hotel, the man told her that it needed 10 quarton per night. The main character was surprised and asked what. She said it was written on the outside again, but the man said it was for one person. He said there were 3 of them, but he would charge for 2 because they were still children. Karina said she understood and gave the man the money. At this point, the man asked her who she was to these 2. He said that if she didn't tell him, he couldn't stop because that was their rule. To avoid suspicion, Karina did not say anything to Roland and Melissa and answered herself. She said she was their mum. The man was surprised and asked if she was their mother. He said the children must have taken after their father. He said they could take the room at the end of the corridor. Afterwards in the room, the protagonist sat down opposite the children and addressed them. She said she was sorry but had to say, without consulting them, that they were her children. She said otherwise she'd be suspected of kidnapping them. The main character said that they would be asked this question many times in the future. She asked if it would be all right if she pretended to be their mom. But the kids said it was great. Melissa said she always wanted the main character to be her. Roland said he also thinks it would be great if they were her kids. The protagonist realized they loved her, but had no idea they loved her that much. Melissa asked, meaning they could call her mum now. The main character said yes. She hugged the children and said of course they could. After the kids settled down and the main character told them to stay here and rest. Melissa asked her where she was going. Karina said she wanted to look around in case she could find a job. Roland told her not to worry and they would be here. Karina told the children that she would be back soon and asked them not to open the door for anyone. A man asked the protagonist if she was raising 2 children alone. He asked if she would need a break if they got sick or something. The second time, Karina was also refused, because they were afraid that she would have to be absent because of her children, after again saying they don't hire single mothers. Already the protagonist has been turned down in 10 places. She has one last shot. The protagonist entered the shop and approached a man. She said she saw he had an open position, but the man immediately asked if she knew the difference between a ruby and a garnet. Karina queried, but the man said he only takes people who know about gemstones. Karina replied that she was a fast learner and asked to be given a chance. But the man said he needed someone who would get straight to work and he didn't have time to teach the basics. He said he was busy and asked the girl to leave. But at that moment, an unknown man entered the shop and approached the wielder, asking if he could examine the magic crystal again. The shopkeeper asked his lordship to wait downstairs for a while and said that he would come soon. Karina was frustrated and thought she'd had enough for today. But at that moment, she detected an unknown glow. That's when she saw the rock. She realized that it looked like an ordinary stone, but she couldn't stop looking at it for some reason. At this point, the salesman asked the protagonist what she was doing and told her to step back. Karina realized that some invisible force was making her hand reach for that stone. At this point, the salesman yelled out what the hell she was doing. At that moment, the protagonist took a rock in her hand. She felt very hot after that. Her whole body felt like it was on fire. At that moment, the guy who had recently entered the shop took the protagonist by the hand. After a while, Karina woke up not realizing what was happening. Suddenly, she felt very cold. She didn't realize that she had been doused with cold water, but at that moment the guy asked her if she was okay. Karina was embarrassed because she didn't understand who this man was and why he was holding her in his arms. She stood up abruptly and shoved the guy. The salesman approached him and asked if he was okay. The guy told the main character that he saved her and how she responded. He said it was rude. Karina lowered her eyes and apologized. She didn't understand what was going on here. She assumed that the stone was used to blow something up. At this point, the guy said that if he hadn't intervened, the girl would be dead by now. He said her body would have been completely destroyed by the explosion. He said of course with this shop. The guy asked the clerk if he was crazy. He asked why he had left such a dangerous stone unattended. But Wilder said he had previously told this lady to leave. But the guy asked the salesman if he could hear him at all. At this point, the protagonist wondered what he had just said. At this point, the guy said he completely forgot to introduce himself. He's the Duke of Torres. He asked who she was. This meeting changed Karina's fate forever. The protagonist introduced herself to the Duke. Torres surprised and said what was the first time he had heard of her name. But the protagonist said she'd only recently moved here. She understood what the Duke was doing in a simple jeweler's shop. In the story, after Roland came of age, Duke Torres became the source of all his troubles. The commoners shunned Roland because of his constant confrontation with the Duke, while the nobles saw him only as an archmage and tried to slaughter him at all costs. Torres's recognition of the man's talent only fueled the general interest in him. Even the highest mages fought each other to gain such a valuable ally. And all this prevented the start of the life Roland dreamed of. He wanted to live an ordinary life with the people he loved. The protagonist thought that if the two of them ever ran into each other again, so she thought she should stay away from anything that had anything to do with the talent fan. She thought she should leave right now. Karina bowed her head to the Duke and thanked him for saving her. But she said she had to leave. But at that moment Torres stopped her and said he overheard her and Artem talking. He asked if she needed a job. Karina said yes, but she said the salesman said he was looking for someone who knew everything about gemstones. She apologized but said she had to go. But at that moment Wilder stopped the girl and said that she had said she needed a job because she had 2 children. He said he would pay enough so she could support herself and them. The Duke thought it seemed something like that had been mentioned. The salesman told the protagonist that he would pay her 900 kivrins. He said she would receive 900 kivrins every month. He said she couldn't find a place in this town that offered more. Karina realized that it was more than enough for the 3 of them to do without. But at that moment she wondered if the Duke was in the shop. What if Roland ran into him? The protagonist thought it would be better to look elsewhere, even if it took longer. Karina thanked the man for the offer but said she had to decline. She said she didn't think she was right for the job. Wilder asked the girl to stay but she just left. Afterwards, the children had dinner at home. Melissa said she was full, but that's when her stomach rumbled. She got embarrassed and said it was strange because she had eaten a lot, but her stomach was still teaching her. At this point, Melissa started to leave and said it was time for her to brush her teeth. She started dragging Roland behind her and told him to come quickly. Karina realized that Melissa knew they didn't have enough and didn't want to burden her by hiding the fact that she wasn't full. Karina realized that at this rate they would soon begin to starve. The protagonist realized that 900 a month would be enough to eat enough, and even to cover the costs of moving to the capital. But the protagonist decided that she would always keep her children away from the jewelry shop. She realized that she would have to be very careful until they left. The next day, the protagonist told the kids that she forgot to buy groceries yesterday, so she has to leave again for a while. The children agreed and asked her to bring something tasty. Karina thought she would work for the old man for a while, and nothing would happen if she was careful. She thought Roland would never meet the Duke. At that moment, the protagonist entered the shop where Duke and Wilder were waiting for her. The protagonist thanked the Duke again for saving her yesterday. She didn't understand why she was here again. But Thoros told the girl to stop thanking him, but said that once was enough. He asked what made her come back. Wilder didn't realize if she had changed her mind. Karina wasn't sure if their offer was still on the table. Wilder said sure. The protagonist asked if he'd really pay her 900 kurvan a month. Wilder said of course, but he asked if she'd decided to stay. He asked if she could sit down and they could sign a contract. At this point, the protagonist said she had 2 conditions. She first asked me to explain what had happened yesterday. She asked if the stone she had touched yesterday was charged with magic. She said if there was any chance of it happening again, she wouldn't work here. She said if she gets injured or killed, there's no one to take care of her children. That's why she is concerned about yesterday's incident. The protagonist asked if they could tell what exactly happened and why. But at that moment, the Duke said it wasn't the girl's fault. It was Wilder's. He said it was wrong to leave dangerous objects lying around. Karina asked the Duke what he meant. Wilder said the Duke was right. He said he didn't think it through, and by leaving the stone in an easily accessible place, he said he just didn't expect a person capable of activating the stone to be around. Karina asked why he reacted to her like that. The Duke said there's only one possible explanation for the girl's magical potential. He said that yesterday she got close to the rock and triggered the explosion. He said there are 3 ways this reaction happens. The first, The newcomer uses a strong spell that he doesn't have the strength for and loses control. Second, the mage ignores the limitations of magic, which has consequences. And the third, when the mage fails to curb the crystal that has spiraled out of control. The Duke told the protagonist that the last case was about her. He said that apparently the stone couldn't withstand the prolonged exposure to her energy. But the main character said she didn't use magic yesterday. But she didn't just say yesterday. She said she'd never been interested in it at all. The Duke said it was obvious. He said that's why he said potential. He said it's not enough to be born with a magical gift, you have to practice it constantly to develop it. But he said very few people are born with that kind of talent. He said there's no one in their town with that kind of power. Said that's why he left the stone in such an easily accessible place. But he said that if Karina worked for him, everything would change. He said he promises that he'll be as attentive to magic subjects as possible. He said that what happened yesterday wouldn't happen again, and she wouldn't have to worry. The protagonist agreed and said she had a second condition. She said that if she said she wanted to leave, the man would let her go without asking questions. Wilder tried to object and said that if she suddenly wanted to leave, but at that moment the Duke interrupted him and offered to sign the girl to a contract. He said that Wilder would treat her so well that she wouldn't have to think about leaving. He asked the salesman if he was right. Wilder said of course he was. The protagonist said then she accepts their offer. She asked where they would start. The Duke said that's great. He said there was something the girls should look at first. At this point, Wilder pulled out a box of crystals and asked the Duke if he meant it. He said that they had acquired 15 magic crystals with a disturbed magic balance. Wilder asked, and how do they estimate it? He said it would take forever. The protagonist didn't understand what kind of crystals were out of balance. She knew that Renka used almost all kinds of stones, but this was the first she'd heard of them. At this point, Wilder asked the protagonist to come closer and take a look. He said that's what she was going to do. After that, the protagonist walked over and started looking at the crystals. At that moment, she saw that one was different from the others. The Duke asked if she could see anything, but Wilder started laughing and said of course not. He said they all looked the same. But Torres told the salesman it wasn't him he was asking. The Duke once again asked the protagonist if she could see anything. Karina said there was only one magic crystal. Wilder asked if she was sure. He told her not to jump to conclusions. The main character said yes. She took the crystal and said this is the real one. The Duke realized that she had done well and quickly. He thought he knew there was something about her. The Duke told the salesman he'd test the stone and told him to do the rest, in which I asked the Duke if he really thought they could do it without him. But the Toros left without listening to the man. Wilder asked if he was worthy of such a job, but he said he just had to trust the Duke anyway. He said he had Zoki eyes, and since the employee he'd bumped off turned out to be so gifted. Wilder welcomed the protagonist. It had been a week since Wilder had taken the protagonist into the shop. She thought that the job didn't seem to be too difficult. She does odd jobs and studies all sorts of gems like rubies or garnets, but Wilder still doesn't tell her anything about the mathematical crystals. Instead, he only asks to examine them and share his opinion. The protagonist realized that everything was quite calm, but she was disturbed by the fact that the Duke seemed to be quite close to Artem, and this could be a problem. The protagonist was thinking and accidentally said the Duke's name. At this point, Wilder asked her why it was suddenly her talking about him. He asked if she had something to do with him, but Karina said she just thought she hadn't seen him for a few days. Wilder said that apparently the Duke was busy with the imbalanced crystals, the ones he picked up the other day. He said that the Duke had been fascinated by the stones since he was young, so that he literally lost track of time when he sat down to study them. The protagonist realizes that the Duke seems to have known the man for a very long time. At that moment, Wilder asked Karina to put the broom down, because he wanted to hear her opinion about these specimens. Later that night, Wilder said that the protagonist could tell at a glance which stone was magical. He said she definitely has the gift. He told her to remember his words. Wilder said that in 3 years she would be able to open her own shop, which would be much bigger than this shop. Karina asked if she was going to trade crystals, but Wilder said that it was more likely to trade in magic itself. He said it's a pretty lucrative business. There's just one downside to dealing with dark magicians. The main character asked a man if Duke Thoros was a magician. Wilder was surprised and asked her if he had told her. But at that moment someone walked into the shop. Karina started to turn around and greeted the visitor, but it was the Duke and he welcomed the main character. Wilder told the Duke he was just in time. He said they were just mentioning him. Karina explained that the Duke had dropped by when the conversation was about magic crystals, said he was right on time then. He handed Wilder a pouch and Wilder asked if it was from the Imperial family. Torres confirmed this and said it was his headache. Wilder asked him why he had a headache. He said he was the only one suffering. Afterwards, Wilder handed the pouch to Karina and asked her to take a look. But when the girl looked inside, she was very surprised. Wilder asked her if she was seeing things. Karina said it was something dangerous. She said it looked like the rock she saw when she first came here. She said she thought it was going to explode. At that moment, the Duke snatched the pouch from Karina, asked how they could give him such a crystal. At this point, Wilder told the protagonist to take a closer look. He said that this was the side of his personality that the girl was interested in. The protagonist realized that no matter which way you look at it, Thoros doesn't look like a magician. But she didn't realize that he was using magic crystals in his own way. But at that moment something appeared in the Duke's hands. After abruptly the whole room was filled with smoke. The protagonist did not understand what happened because everything was covered with smoke, and she could not see anything. But at that moment she saw a sword appear in the Duke's hands. Duke smiled and said it worked this time. Wilder asked what he meant this time. But the Duke asked him if he remembered the magic crystal that reacted to the main character. He said that so far he hadn't been able to convert it into a magic sword. Wilder got angry at the guy and asked if he hadn't told him to be careful. Duke said he only makes a mistake a couple of times a year. But Wilder asked him if anything happened, who would be responsible. But the Duke told the man that he had been lecturing him lately. The Duke realized that whatever the protagonist was, she had immediately determined that the crystal was magical. He realized that she was probably much more talented than he had thought. At that moment Thoros turned to Karina and said that she had been very helpful. He said that she had almost let a magic crystal, a gift from the Emperor himself, explode. He said he would like to thank her in some way. Karina said she wasn't grateful, but she said she'd like to know what just happened. The Duke asked if she'd had enough of his explanation, and the protagonist confirmed it. But she figured that if the guy insisted on a reward, she wouldn't resist. The Duke said he should start by saying he's a magic knight then. But Wilder asked the guy if he thought the protagonist would understand what he had just said, but the Duke said that he just wanted to clarify. At that moment, Karina wondered what they had in common, if Wilder allowed himself to talk to him in such a tone. At this point, the Duke began to speak. He said that what distinguishes them from ordinary targets is their ability to transform magic crystals into swords. That is, knights who are not mages can use magic swords thanks to their skills. The Duke said he could be called a kind of blacksmith. Karina asked if she understood correctly he turned the magic crystal into a sword. She asked if this sword was an object created by concentrating energy. The Duke confirmed what she said. But Karina said she could sense that the sword was emanating magic, and quite dangerous. At that moment, the Duke handed the sword to Wilder and asked him to hide it in a safe place. At that moment, Toro started to approach Karina and said that he had met talented people before, but had never seen anyone like her before. The protagonist said she was very honored. The Duke said that if he missed this chance, his late parents would never forgive him. He took the girl's hands and asked her to accept his proposal. He asked if she would agree to serve the House of Thors. The protagonist didn't realize that he wanted her to be his servant. She realized that to be a servant of the Duke, she had to be at least the daughter of a knight. But she didn't understand why a guy would suggest such a thing without knowing anything about her background. Torres asked Karina if she was interested, but Karina asked how a commoner like her could serve him. But Torres said that a good half of his servants were not of noble birth. He said that most of the nobles of Torres had left the capital. He said they thought of it as a province, a place where they could just relax from the hustle and bustle. The Duke offered to take Wilder, for example. He said that he was not even a knight, but had become a subject of the House of Thors. The Duke said that he had helped his parents for many years and knew him from childhood. The Duke asked the girl what she would say. He said that now she had no reason to reject her proposal, but the main character said she had kids to take care of. But the Duke said if she worked for him, it would be better for them. He said he'd pay her more than she gets now. But Karina said that the Duke's servants have many duties. The Duke said that they probably do. Karina realized that then she wouldn't be able to spend enough time with Roland and Melissa. She realized that it couldn't be like that. At this point, the protagonist bowed her head and told the Duke that she thanked him for his trust in her, but she had to refuse. The Duke asked if he could find out the reason. Karina said she couldn't swear allegiance to him. The Duke asked if it was because of her children again. The main character confirmed it. She said that she could not spend the time she had to spend with them at work. Torres smiled and said he was glad to know that was the only reason. The protagonist was surprised and asked what he was talking about, but the Duke said he was under the impression that she didn't want to see him. The protagonist was surprised and asked how he could think that. She realized that he had picked up on the fact that she was nervous when he was around. The Duke laughed and said he was joking. He asked the girl if her children were doing well. Karina said yes and thought the guy was very handsome when he smiled. The Duke asked if they were going to school. The protagonist wanted to say yes, but at that moment she realized the question. At this point, Wilder told the Duke that the protagonist had been living away from the major cities all along, and she knew very little about how things worked in Torres. The Duke asked, but even if one lives in a village, isn't he supposed to send his children to school? Well, Wilder said that in many regions it is not necessary to do so. Artem told the protagonist that in Torres there was an institution called schools. He said they are for kids whose families can't afford private tutors. The protagonist realized it was the same system she had in her previous life. She asked what the children were learning. Duke said they're studying counting and writing. Karina was surprised and asked, and that was all. The Duke was also surprised and asked that wasn't enough. He asked if there was anything else they needed to know. Karina asked if they didn't learn complex calculations and formulas. She reminded him that they had been through a lot of that in her previous life. But at that moment, Wilder laughed and told the girl that parents would not be happy if they taught such useless things at school. He said that is useless when it comes to making a living. The night the protagonist was coming home, she realized that if the children went to school, they would be able to make friends among their peers, and that was not a bad thing. But she realized that what mattered most was how Roland and Melissa would react to the idea. She thought she should ask them what they thought about it. For the first time in a long time, the protagonist was able to buy them biscuits. She thought they would have tea and biscuits together and chat. But when the protagonist entered the room, she was very frightened. She asked what happened here. The room was a mess, like there was a tornado inside. At this point, Karina began to call out fearfully to the children. The protagonist didn't realize where they were. She thought they might have been kidnapped by the people who had trashed the room. She fell to the floor and thought she shouldn't have left them alone. She thought she should have protected them. Karina realized that only one person could have done this: Renka. At that moment, the protagonist heard the voice of Roland addressing her. She realized the kids were in the bathroom and started running in there. When she went into the bathroom, she saw soiled children. Roland said they were trying to clean up the spilled batter. But Karina dropped to the floor and said she was very glad they were okay. She realized that all this slop was just dough and Renka had nothing to do with it. Roland was upset and apologized to the main character. He said they messed up the room and the bathroom. Melissa said it was all their fault and they were sorry. But the protagonist told the kids that everything was fine and asked if she could find out what happened. Roland said they wanted to bake bread. He said they used magic, but something went wrong. He said his uncle never taught them how to cook with magic. Karina hugged the children and said they must have been scared. She knew that Renka had only taught them destruction magic. She realized it wasn't surprising that they couldn't use it for domestic purposes. The protagonist was afraid that afterwards the children would decide never to use magic again. She doesn't know if she should be relieved. At this point, the protagonist asked Melissa what was behind her back. Melissa said it was a blanket and it was dirty. Karina told the kids she would take care of the blanket and asked why don't they get cleaned up. After that, the protagonist cleaned the entire room. She remembered the days when she used to clean in Labs. She had a lot of trouble scrubbing off the insides of various creatures stuck on the walls. The memories even made her shiver. At that moment, the children came out of the bath and Roland said they were done. He offered to help her clean up. At this point, the protagonist laughed and asked if they were going to bake bread with their hair. She suggested they wash their heads. After a while, the protagonist had already completely finished cleaning and decided to rest. Karina is very tired because she hasn't had to work so hard in a long time. Roland was upset and asked her if she was tired because of them. Melissa said they wanted to help her cook. Roland said they wanted to make her happy, but it didn't work out. He asked if she was going to be their mom anymore. Karina asked Roland if she had misheard. Roland said that they didn't want her to be tired again because of them. He said they wanted her to be happy and smile every day. But the main character told the children not to worry. She said she could smile every day just because she had them. She said she was also strong enough to withstand their uncle's training. Roland asked if she too had learnt from her uncle, but the main character said no. She said that Renka didn't teach her like he taught them. She said he knew her Dari but was against her developing it. Karina realized what could be said. It was his attitude that drove her curiosity and desire to learn magic. Karina said she's just very experienced in cleaning, so the children don't have to worry about whatever mess is there. She'll sort it all out in no time. Roland said he didn't want her to feel bad after all. He said they wouldn't cause any more trouble and asked me to forgive them. But at that point, the main character told the kids that the only mistake they had made was wanting to do everything alone, with no cooking experience whatsoever. Melissa then asked what they should have done. Karina said that if they had something in mind and they couldn't do it, they could ask her for help. But Roland said they didn't want to tire her out. But the protagonist said it's nothing like that. She said that as long as she has them, she will always be full of energy. She asked since they wouldn't be shy about asking her for help. Roland said yes. After some time in the evening, the protagonist asked the children if they wanted to go to school. Roland asked what they would be doing there. The main character said that there they were taught maths and writing. Roland asked in surprise if they would not learn magic. Karina realized that the children hadn't studied anything but magic. She said that there would be no magic and they would find lots of friends their own age. The children got very excited and said they wanted to go to school. A few days later, the main character remembered that today was the children's first day of school. She wondered how it went. She realized that they should be home by now and worried that they might have been bullied. But at this point, she decided she would go in and just question them herself. The main character entered the room and Melissa was glad she had come. She said it was fun to go to school. She said that her teacher also said she was a good reader. Karina stroked the girl and said she was proud of her. At this point, the main character asked Roland how he was enjoying his first day of school. Roland said he had fun too. Karina realized that the guy didn't have the same reaction as Melissa. She thought he looked downcast. At this point, the main character asked if something was wrong. but the guy said everything was fine. Karina thought he probably didn't want to talk about it all right now. She said she was very happy to hear that, but if he wanted to tell her anything, he could talk any time. Karina gave Roland some tea and honey and asked him to taste it. She told the guy to keep his voice down so he wouldn't wake Melissa. At this point, the protagonist asked the guy if he had made any new friends. Roland said he has Melissa and doesn't need friends. The protagonist realized that, come to think of it, they'd never broken up before, except for the days when he failed a spell and she was punished instead. But as of today, her sister won't be around for hours. The protagonist couldn't even imagine how much she was going through this. She realized that they must be in different classes at school after all. Karina asked Roland if he was so upset that he didn't want to play with the others. Roland said he thought it would be with Molasses, but was told it couldn't be. The boy said that the teacher told him that he should not go to different classes because he was better at writing and reading. He said that if he had known this would happen, he would have pretended not to know. But at that moment, Karina told him not to be upset about them not being together. Roland tried to object, saying that he had to protect Melissa. The main character thought it was because Renka was abusing the girl. Roland said that he should stay by his sister's side until she grew up and became stronger. The main character asked if the guy was worried about his uncle finding them. Roland confirmed this with a nod of his head. Karina knew it couldn't be like this. At that point, she asked the guy what if he did the following. She said he would help Melissa get stronger. She said he could teach her magic. Roland asked if Karina thought Melissa would want to learn from him. But Karina said if he was so worried, they could just ask her. She said Melissa's asleep now, so they'll do it in the morning. But at that moment, Melissa stood up and asked if she could really learn magic. Karina asked if Melissa had heard everything, but Melissa said that was great. She said that if Roland was her teacher, it would be even better. She asked where they would start, and in what he gave the main character's salary. He said it was a bit more than he had promised her. He said she had just moved in, so she would need a lot of money. The main character was Radha and thanked the man. She remembered that Renka had always paid her poorly. At this point, Wilder told the girl that since she had been here, sales had gone up, but he told her not to realize. At that moment, the Duke came into the shop and said that the salesman was right. He said that Wilder wasn't as generous as he might think, so it wasn't worth confessing. Wilder said it's rare for an employer to pay an employee a bonus with the first paycheck. The main character laughed and said Wilder was right. She said she'd be sure to remember the advice. She said that even the prize of 1 kivrin would make her happy. Wilder told the protagonist to hurry home because her children were waiting for her. The protagonist thanked the man once more and left. Karina was very happy with the first one and the salary. She figured that if she was paid that much every month, she'd save up enough to move to the capital pretty quickly. She thought maybe she should suggest that the kids go out to dinner. The main character happily walked into the room and greeted the children. Momentarily upset and crying, Melissa told her that Roland was sick. The protagonist immediately rushed towards the boy. She asked what was going on and if he was feeling bad. When the protagonist touched it, she realized it was on fire. Melissa said she thought Roland was hurt and asked what they should do. The protagonist ran outside and realized that it was a good thing she knew where the hospital was. Karina remembered that in the original story, Roland had never been sick. She didn't understand why it had happened now. She assumed it might be because things weren't going according to plan. She didn't realize if that was the real reason. Although the protagonist realized that she shouldn't jump to conclusions, she realized that the most important thing was for Roland to get better. After some time, the doctor came to the house of the main character. Before examining the boy, he said that in general he does not visit patients at home after work, but he said that for the girl will make an exception so the payment will be double. At this point, when the doctor examined Roland, he said fearfully that he realized what it was. Sadly, he turned to the main character and said that God only knows what will happen to the boy next. Karina was startled and asked the man what he was talking about. The doctor seriously said he wasn't sure, but it looks like it's Pitera. He said that more than half of those infected with it die. He said that even if they survive, they suffer serious consequences and can't lead a normal life. He said there are no doctors in Torres who can help the boy. These words frightened the protagonist madly. Melissa began to cry and begged Roland not to die. Karina couldn't believe what the doctor said. At this point, the man began to gather his belongings and said that there was no treatment for Pitera. He handed the protagonist a bundle and said that if she gave him a tea of willow bark powder, it would help bring down his fever. But he said he was afraid there was nothing more he could do. At this point, the doctor stopped and said that the kids were listening to them so they wouldn't go into detail. Afterwards, he said that the protagonist would have to pay 300 kivrin for the appointment, though he doubted she even had that kind of money. After that, the protagonist handed the man the money, and he was glad because he didn't think that she could pay overtime right now. He started to walk away and wished Karina good luck. The main character fell to her knees not knowing what to do. She couldn't laugh at ending up like this. At that moment, Roland's quiet voice turned to the protagonist. Karina was surprised and asked if he was awake. Roland asked fearfully if he was going to die, but the protagonist assured him that he would not. She smiled and said he would get better and grow up to be an amazing person. She asked him if he knew that Mum knew everything. Roland asked so the main character always knew she was going to be their mum. Karina said of course she did. At that moment, Melissa brought a glass of water and said that Roland should drink the medicine. Karina thanked the girl and told her that Roland would be fine and she could take it easy. Melissa was scared and asked Roland if he would die. Karina told the girl that of course not, because Roland is very strong. Melissa asked if the doctor was wrong when he said Roland wouldn't survive. Karina said she thought so. She said she'd find another doctor tomorrow morning. At this point, the protagonist said he needed to sit down to take his medicine. She said he could sleep afterwards. Roland sat down and asked for the medicine. Karina explained to the boy that Melissa had prepared it for him. After that, Roland calmly drank the medicine. The main character told Roland to wait because she wanted to bring him a wet towel. She said they would put it on his forehead. But at that moment, Roland stopped the protagonist by taking her hand. He said he was going to live in an orphanage. Karina asked the boy in surprise why he was saying that. Roland tells Karina that her uncle isn't here, but she's still scared for him and Melissa. He said that even though they had escaped from his estate, they were the only reason she was in trouble. But the guilt told Roland that without the two of them, she would never have escaped. She said she didn't even look at the Renka house. She felt bad. Karina said that she decided to run away only for the sake of her children. She said that it was only because of them that she was happier than ever before. So the protagonist asked Roland not to say that he would go to the orphanage for her. After that, she told the boy to sleep and then he would feel better. Karina realized that no matter how hard it was, she would stay with the children. She knows very well what goes on in the orphanages. They gather forces that have nowhere else to go, just so they can work for free. Even when the children get sick, no one cares. Roland knows this better than anyone, because he has been to the orphanage before. Karina didn't understand if the children thought she would ever want to give them up. She thought she would have to do her best to win their trust. The next day, another doctor said there was no hope. He said the kid had ACO. He said it had an 80% mortality rate. He said Roland was lucky he didn't die right away. He said it wasn't contagious, so they could be with him till the end. Those words were like an electric shock to the protagonist. She didn't understand how Roland could die and still be called lucky. She didn't understand how the doctor could say it in such an even voice. The doctor said there was no cure, so they could only pray for him. And that's when he started talking about payment. But the protagonist just handed him a bag of money. After that, the doctor greedily counted out the money. Karina was heartbroken because she didn't understand what kind of God it was that was just watching a child die. She didn't realize if Roland was really going to die. Karina realized that yesterday a doctor had said it was Patara. Another had diagnosed ACO. She didn't understand why Roland was so sick that it was impossible to even recognize what was wrong with him. But the protagonist realized that in the original story, he didn't suffer from dangerous diseases. She thought that if the protagonist had escaped from the clutches of death, she would have remembered it. Karina blamed herself and thought it was because she had changed the future. She thought she was the only one to blame for getting sick. Karina almost cried thinking that Roland might die because of her. But at that moment, an unknown woman burst into the room and asked the protagonist, is she Madame Karina after all? The protagonist confirmed this but asked the woman who she was. The woman said it was nice to meet you. She's Dr. Violetta Solvitan. She said she was sent by Mr. Deviathan. Violetta asked if the boy was a patient. The protagonist confirmed it. At that moment, Violetta looked at Roland and apologized. The protagonist couldn't understand who sent this woman. She didn't realize if she could trust her with Roland. But Deviathan sounded familiar to her. At that moment, Violetta approached Roland and asked if there were any other symptoms besides fever. The protagonist said that the boy complained of stomach pains. Violetta asked how many doctors had come. Karina said there were 3 of them. She said that one just looked and left. Violetta asked what they said and asked them to tell everything. The protagonist said that the first one suspected Pitaru, the second assumed Alco, and the third concluded that it was an unknown incurable disease. But at that moment, Violetta angrily said that these people were not worthy to be called doctors. She said Roland had food poisoning. Karina was surprised and asked again. She asked me how that was. She said that food poisoning can't be untreatable, but the doctor said otherwise. But Violetta said that Roland's symptoms were severe, but it was still food poisoning. She said that the boy should be given some rest and he would get better. Violetta said that the poisoning would go away without the medicine, so some people would not want to pay a doctor to give such a diagnosis. She said that this is why doctors say whatever comes into their head, knowing that they can get more money for it. Karina fell to the ground in relief and said that's why they said there was only prayer left. Violetta said that moreover, if the protagonist had given the boy the medicine, the situation could have worsened. But Karina was just glad that Roland wouldn't die. Now she realized that he didn't get sick because she had influenced the events. At this moment, Violetta helped the protagonist stand up. Karina asked the girl how much she owed her, but Violetta said she didn't owe her anything. She said that for a while she should not give the boy anything but water and liquid and porridge. She gave the card to Karina and told her that if he didn't improve, she could ask for help here. The protagonist bowed to the woman and thanked her profusely. Violetta said goodbye and said that it was time for her to leave then. Lastly, the protagonist thanked the woman once again. But at that moment, the protagonist ran out after Violetta and asked her to stop. Violetta was surprised and asked what was wrong. Karina asked who Mr. Leviathan was. She said she wanted to thank him. But Violetta smiled and said that actually the main character had already met him. Karina was surprised and asked who he was. But Violetta said she was afraid Mr. Leviathan didn't want the protagonist to know the secret of his identity. She said she would give him her thanks. The protagonist was at a loss for who it could be. At this point, Melissa approached the main character and asked if Roland was going to be okay. Karina stroked the girl and said, of course. She said that he would soon be on the mend and she could take it easy. Melissa gripped the main character's dress tighter and said she was very worried about Roland. But Karina hugged the girl and promised that everything would be okay. She thought that the name Leviathan had been mentioned in the original story, but she was sorry she couldn't remember who it belonged to. But at that moment, the protagonist remembered something from the novel. Renka asked Roland if he believed he was his real uncle, and that he had inherited the blood of the Renka house. Renka that his sister married a commoner and died childless. Renka said that Roland and Melissa had nothing to do with him. Roland asked the man then why he wanted them. He asked why it had to be him and Melissa, but Renka said they were the only ones in the orphanage with magical potential. He said the headmaster sold them for a handful of pennies. Renka said that the headmaster said that by pretending to be their relatives, he could do whatever he wanted to them, and no one would dare interfere. Roland realized that his uncle had deceived him. He told him that he didn't want to kill him because he thought he was their mother's brother. But now Roland realized it was all a lie. When Roland learned the truth, he despaired to the point where he lost control of his magic and fell into madness. At that time, Roland had already reached the Archmage level, so he had the power to destroy everything around him. After that day, no one called him Archmage anymore. People nicknamed him the killer of 1,000 people. The protagonist realized it had happened again. A fragment of history she had forgotten resurfaced in her mind. He describes the details of an event that tormented Roland for the rest of his days. Karina decided that she would do anything to give her children a better life. After a while at work, Wilder told Karina that she looked happy. He asked if her son was on the mend. The protagonist confirmed this and thanked the man for asking. She said she was sorry she couldn't work those few days. But Wilder said it's no big deal. He said it's okay to take a break when a child is sick. He said she even came in that morning to tell him in person, and it was on such a crazy day. Karina told the man that she promised to work double time until closing time. But Wilder said that was not enough, and she would have to work overtime to make up the missed time. The protagonist was confused and a little scared and questioned what. But Wilder laughed and said it was just a joke. At that moment, the protagonist remembered something and said that she had forgotten to thank the man for sending Dr. Violetta to her. But Wilder asked who she said he had sent. The protagonist called the woman's name again and asked if he had sent it, but Wilder said no. He said it wasn't from him and she wouldn't have listened to him even if he had asked her. But Karina said that Violetta had told her that she had been sent by someone she knew and that she had no acquaintances other than him. Wilder asked if she had not told him who her benefactor was. But Karina said Violetta called him Mr. Leviathan. Asked the protagonist if she was sure it wasn't hearsay, but Karina said she was quite sure of it. She asked the man if he knew him. Wilder said he was one of their customers, and he was also interested in the reason why the protagonist of the shop was absent. He said she told him the reason for her absence. Karina realized it was one of the customers. She said that now she understood why the name seemed familiar. Wilder looked away awkwardly and told her it was okay to say that. Karina asked Wilder if he knew where Leviathan lived, because she wanted to visit him personally and thank him. But Wilder smiled and said he would be sure to convey her gratitude to him. Wilder said he would be pleased. Sometime later in the evening, the main character was dressing the children. She asked Roland if he wanted to make a good impression on Mr. Leviathan. Roland said of course he did. At this point, Melissa asked Karina who he was Mr. Leviathan. Karina said with a smile that she had never seen him before, but she was sure he was a very nice man. She said that he thought it would be too tiring for them to go to him, as he did not live close by. So instead, he decided to visit them himself. Roland said with a smile that when the man arrived, he would thank him for his help. Karina praised the boy and said the man would be happy to see him in good health. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. The main character said it had to be him. At this point, she ran up to Tiberi and greeted the man. But when she opened the door, she saw the Duke. Torres said he knew it wasn't polite, but he said he wanted to visit her at least once. Karina realized that she couldn't keep her guest in the doorway and motioned for the Duke to enter. Then she said she was afraid it was too modest for him, but asked him to sit down. She said she'd bring tea. The main character couldn't believe that Duke Toros was the same Mr. Leviathan. Karina was frightened because she didn't understand what would happen if the Duke recognized Roland's potential to become an archmage. In parallel, the children just stared at the Duke in surprise. Torres saw it. At this point, Melissa extended her hand to the man and said it was nice to meet you. She introduced herself and introduced her brother. The Duke said it was a pleasure to meet him too. At this point, Karina tried to tell the kids that it wasn't Mr. Leviathan, but the Duke stopped her and said it was. The protagonist apologized and was asked what he meant, but the Duke explained that his full name was Claude Leviathan Thor. He said that Tauros is more like a title, and it's usually limited to Claude Leviathan. The main character asked so the one who sent the doctor was him. The Duke blamed that he thought the girl would refuse after learning the sender's name. He said it was no disrespect to her not to think anything unnecessary, but tried to reassure the Duke said everything was fine and there was absolutely nothing to worry about. The protagonist realized that she had to say that everything was fine even if it wasn't. She realized that she couldn't ask the Duke to explain why he had lied. At this point, an awkward atmosphere hung in the room. Karina told Jiku that this was the second time she owed him. She said that first he saved her, and now her son. Karina bowed her head and said she didn't know how to thank him. She said she was eternally grateful for his help and that thanks to the Duke her son was alive and well. At this point, Melissa also thanked the Duke and said that her mom had said that Roland was better because of him. Well, at that point, the main character stopped Melissa and told her not to address the Duke that way. But he smiled too and said it was all right because she was just a child. He said he only called Violetta and asked her to come in. He said there was nothing to thank him for. At that moment, Tauros said that Violetta had also told him about the other doctors. He said that those people who made wrong diagnoses would be punished. The Duke quietly asked how they could fool people in trouble. He said they were the real villains. Karina said she was glad to hear that. She said she hopes no one else gets hurt because of them. She told the Duke that he does a lot for his subjects. Torres laughed and thanked the main character for saying that. At this point, he looked at Roland and said the boy was very handsome. After a while, Karina cleaned the chair and thought this was all very strange. She didn't understand why the Duke would personally forge all this way among the squalid stands of their courts. She understood why he would sit with a commoner at this rude table. At this point, the main character accidentally said out loud that she didn't understand, and Roland asked her what she didn't understand. Karina explained to the boy that she just didn't understand why the Duke was so kind to them. Roland asked if that was a bad thing. Karina said of course not. The boy asked means it's not wrong. But most importantly, the heroine explained to Waku that usually high-ranking nobles like the Duke didn't care about a commoner like them. She didn't understand if the Duke had already realized that Roland was capable of becoming an archmage. She thought it was silly to think that everything was all right, and since Roland was still young, she didn't realize what would happen if the Duke suddenly found out how talented the boy was. Karina realized she couldn't let that happen. At this point, Melissa told her mom that she thought it was because the Duke liked her. Karina was surprised and asked the girl what she was talking about. But Melissa said that Roland had told her that the Duke kept looking at her and smiling. Melissa said she thinks the Duke really likes the main character. But Karina said it was simply impossible. But Melissa said that every time she looked away, the Duke kept her eyes on her. But Karina said the kids shouldn't tease her like that. But Melissa said she wasn't teasing. She said the Duke's eyes were glued to her. Karina asked in disbelief. Roland confirmed it. He said that the Duke looked at the protagonist almost like he was mesmerized. He said he swore that even if the protagonist looked away for just a moment, the Duke smiled at her. But Karina told the children that they couldn't just tell her that. Roland was surprised and asked why not. The protagonist explained that this was because Duke Thores holds a very high position in society. She said that if anyone heard what they had just said, they would tell the town guard, and they would come after them. The kids asked that as the protagonists are going to lend the guards to them. But the main character laughed and said, of course not. She asked how you can complain about such wonderful children. The main character said that Duke Thoros will marry a lady who will be beautiful like a princess. But Melissa told Karina that she too was as beautiful as a princess. The main character took the girl in her arms and thanked her, but she said Melissa was much, much prettier than she was. At this moment, Roland's gaze slid downwards and he looked somehow sad. Melissa told Karina with a smile that she liked Duke Thoros because he looked like a prince. She said it would be nice if he came to visit them every day. But at that point, Roland said he didn't like him. He asked Karina what if the Duke wanted to marry her. The protagonist interjected to marry her. She asked Roland where he got that from. The boy said that Karina had taken a liking to the Duke, and so he might want to take her as his wife to live together. The protagonist hugged the boy and said it would never happen. The main character didn't understand how the children saw it and thought it was very sweet. Roland said that Karina is very beautiful, and there is nothing they can do about the fact that people like her. But he said that the way they live with just the three of them, he doesn't want that to change. The main character told the boy that she liked the threesome too, so she asked him not to worry. Roland asked if she was telling the truth. He asked if it was true or if she was telling the truth. Karina said that of course, and he could care less. After that, the children started to get ready for bed. Karina realized that the children were already in bed, so she should get ready for bed too. At that moment, she saw her reflection and was horrified at how awful her hair looked. She thought that the Duke must have been smiling because he was laughing at her. Karina realized she was neatly dressed, but her hair was so zero and it must have looked ridiculous. At that moment, Karina came up to the children and asked why they had not told her that her head was a mess. But they were surprised, and Roland asked what was wrong with her hair. The main character said that it was tangled and dirty, but Melissa asked how she knew that. She said her hair wasn't dirty, it was beautiful. Karina questioned whether they were telling the truth. She thought it was unlikely that the Duke would be interested in her after this. She thought she was just sand under his feet. For a while, the children fell asleep and the main character sat beside the bed. The whole time they were here, the main character was worried about what would happen if the talent fan met Roland. She couldn't believe that their meeting ended up being so mundane. The main character realized that they had met after all. But the Duke didn't react when he saw Roland. I didn't realize that vaginally he wasn't trying to recruit Roland. The protagonist looked at the boy and didn't realize if everything was going to be all right. Given that the boy was little, it was too early for him to become an archmage. Karina thought that in addition, the Duke doesn't even know that Roland has magic. She thought maybe that's why she shouldn't worry so much about it. The next day in the shop, the protagonist told Wilder that she thought he should have told her who Mr. Leviathan was. She said that if she had known beforehand, she would have prepared better. But Wilder said it was a lie. He said if she found out, she wouldn't want to go out with him at all. He said that in addition, if she had known whose help she had taken advantage of, she would not have been so glad and grateful to him. Karina said that's exactly right. But she said having a Duke come to her house was no small thing. But Wilder apologized. He said that his lordship insisted that everything be kept secret. He said he had no choice. Karina asked if he thought it was cruel to her. But Wilder offered to end it there. He asked the protagonist to come to him because now she would learn something new. The main character asked what it was. Wilder asked what she thought it was. He said he was waiting for her guesses. The main character on the calf asked what it could be and said she was very interested. She didn't realize that Wilder couldn't just say. Wilder explained that, as the girl knew, they had more and more young customers lately. He said that they hadn't become interested in their merchandise since the protagonist started working here. But she explained that they tended to accessorize rather than gemstones. And since they are about the same age, Wilder thought that the main character could develop herself in this direction and cater to these clients. Told her that she's got a grasp on the litho, so he suggested she try it. He told Karina to come over and see which one was best. The main character began to look at it and wondered. After a while, she asked if they were different. She said they looked the same to her. Wilder was surprised and asked the girl to look more closely. He pointed to one brooch and asked, "Isn't it obvious that this one is better?" Wilder said the main character thought who would want a maggot, but the main character said she didn't think anyone would want a dolly. But Wilder said it didn't matter. He said he wasn't asking about their beauty. He said his question was actually about understanding the basics of magical theory. Karina asked if the man meant to say that accessories are not just about looking pretty. Art said that was absolutely right. He suggested that the girl should first think about the meaning of the doll, at which point he himself said that it often symbolizes growth, transformation, breakthrough, and evolution. He asked, and what connects it all? He said it was magic. Wilder said the outside of the doll looks inanimate, but inside is relentlessly preparing for the next phase. And when the time comes, and the Kukana is born with a beautiful butterfly that can fly, Wilder explained that the same thing happens with mages. He said that their training is hard and tiring, but as if it was useless. He said that sometimes they feel like they're not getting anywhere, but when they go through the process and come out in them, they will become outstanding magicians. Wilder said there's no way to cheat. He said that it is very dangerous to develop magic only from the practical side and ignore the theory. He said that a man's inability to control his own power could lead to disaster. He said that magic spells without any foundation are nothing more than a sandcastle that will easily collapse in the rain. Wilder explained that it was important for a jewelry merchant to know at least some magical theory, so he would teach the main character. The protagonist has realized that if she learns the magical art of Wilder, she will be able to teach the same to her children. She thanked the man and said she would learn from everyone. In the evening after work at the protagonist's house, Roland said he thought the butterfly leaving the chrysalis was better. Karina thought she knew that. She thought that Roland was born to be a wizard. She praised the guy and said he did a good job. Roland asked if that was the right answer. The main character explained to the children that Wilder told them what the doll symbolized. After a while, when she had told everything, she asked the children if they understood it. Roland was delighted and said of course. Melissa yawned because she was bored. At this point, the protagonist asked the girl if she was bored. She suggested doing something else, but Melissa flatly refused. She said she just wanted to learn something more interesting. She said she wanted to learn some cool and powerful magic spells, the kind that makes a lot of noise and light. Melissa said her uncle only taught Roland, but she wants to learn too. Roland said Melissa had always wanted to learn real magic. He said he would teach her, but he couldn't because he was sick. Melissa said she wanted to learn cool magic spells that glow, sparkle, make noise, and blow up. But the main heroine told the girl that this kind of magic is very dangerous. She explained that wizards have a hard time with it, and it can easily hurt you. Karina asked if they could start with something simple. Melissa asked what it was like. The main character couldn't answer anything at first. She didn't understand what kind of magic she was even aware of. She understood something the Renka practiced was too dangerous. And besides him, The only other person she had seen in the case was Duke Thoros. The main character remembered that the Duke said it wasn't magic, but it still looked very dangerous. At this point, Roland asked the protagonist if there were any spells that could speed up the growth and flowering of plants. He said the little flowers blooming are beautiful and not dangerous at all. At this point, the main character thought that Roland looked worried when he talked about magic. Roland said that it is quite safe to apply life-enhancing magic to plants because they are carried mad like animal and monsters. Karina realized that if magic wasn't dangerous, Roland liked it even more. But Melissa said with a disgruntled look on her face that it was too boring. The main character asked the girl if she knew the reason why she was against dangerous magic. Melissa said she did. She said that the main character doesn't want them to get hurt. Karina said that's right. She said they don't want any pain or injury. Melissa smiled and said she was a good girl so she would listen to her mum. After a while, Roland brought in the dandelions that had bloomed. He said they'd try to get them back to blooming. Melissa picked up a dandelion and said it was very nice and round. After that, they gave a dandelion to the main character. Karina asked if she needed one too. Roland was confused and asked if it would be weird if he taught magic to her too. He apologized and said it was just that the main character had said she hadn't studied magic before. But most importantly, the heroine patted the boy on the head and thanked him for worrying about her. Renka had never taught his magic to the protagonist before, even though she had always wanted to learn magic. But now that Roland was teaching her something that Renka wouldn't even let her go near, the protagonist wondered how he would like it. Roland said that first he would demonstrate how to do it. He began to recite the spell. Roland said they focused on the dandelion and imagined what it looked like when it was in bloom. After that, Melissa also began to recite the spell. Afterwards, she was very happy because she did it. The main character was surprised that Melissa got it right on the first try. At this point, Roland asked her if she was nervous. He told my mum not to worry and that everything would be fine. The main character smiled at the children and thanked them for supporting her. After that, Karina concentrated and believed that she couldn't look weak in front of the children. After Karina used the spell, the dandelions became 3. The main character was very happy because she did it. Melissa was also happy and said that Karina got it right on the first try. Roland was also surprised because there were more colors, but the main character said it was weird that there were 3 flowers on one stem. She asked if they didn't look a little strange, but Roland said he thought they were beautiful. The protagonist asked if he really thought so. She said that it was the first flowers they had made with magic and offered to put them in a vase. The children agreed and said that then they could admire them every day. Then the main character put the flowers in a vase and asked how about putting them on the table. The children agreed and said that it was a great place for the vase and that the flowers would last a long time. Karina couldn't believe she had done what Renka had always forbidden her to do. In that moment, she felt liberated. At this point, Roland asked the main character when they were going to eat. Melissa said she was hungry too. Karina realized it was lunchtime and she asked the children what they would like. At the same time, the kids said they'd like a ham baguette. Karina asked what they would say to a ham and cheese sandwich then, and also a salad. The kids were very upset because they didn't like the salad. But the main character said they shouldn't be so fussy. She said she'd make the salad while the kids washed their hands. Well, when the main character apple, something started to happen. The protagonist didn't notice anything, but she heard a strange sound. She thought it was an explosion and shouted for the kids to run. The main character thought it was Renka because he was the only one who could attack them. Then the main character ran to the children who were surprised and told her to look at something. But most importantly, the heroine hid the children in front of her and thought the explosion was like a bomb going off in the room. She didn't realize what it was. This is the moment Karina asked the kids if they were okay. She began to examine them and asked if anything hurt. But at that moment, Roland told the protagonist to look back. He said it was just a tree. Karina agreed and was told it looked like an apple tree. Roland asked the protagonist if she was really scared. But Karina denied it and said she was just a little surprised. At this point, the protagonist turned to Roland and said that if it was about the yak, she was the only one who touched it, so it was all her fault. Roland said he'd never seen anything like it, and his uncle had never told him about it. At this point, Melissa asked her brother if it could be the effects of the magic they were using. The main character was surprised and thought it couldn't be. She didn't realize if it was really all about them working with dandelions. Roland told the protagonist that Melissa was right. He said it could be all about residual magic. The main character thought that it turns out she couldn't control her powers. She didn't understand if that was why Renka didn't let her study and kept her away from everything magical. Karina realized that if you thought about it, he only practiced dangerous, destructive spells, and perhaps he was afraid she might hurt him because of poor control. But the heroine realized that now it was more important to understand how long this effect of the spell would last. At that moment, Melissa asked the main character if she wanted them to remove the tree. Karina told the children that of course not, because she could do it herself. But before the main character touched the tree again, the children told her that if she touched it, it might grow even bigger. Karina got upset and realized that this was indeed the case, but agreed with the kids said they'd do it for her, but only today. But in return, the kids asked that they not eat the salad today, because it might grow really big. The next morning, The protagonist was already approaching the shop where she worked. She figured kids are kids like that. After all, they weren't thrilled when she let them go without salad. Enough of the moment the heroine noticed at the entrance to the shop an unknown parcel and thought it was a parcel for Wilder. She didn't know if she should open it, but she thought it would be better to wait for him to go. The main character put the box on the counter and thought she'd leave it there. At this point, Wilder came into the shop and said that the main character was early as always. That's when he noticed the box and asked what it was. Karina explained that the man had received a parcel. She read that the sender's address was the Duke's estate. Wilder explained that his lordship must have sent him a new batch of magic crystals to evaluate. He asked the protagonist if she would open it. Karina opened the parcel and was surprised because the fabric felt like silk. After that, Wilder asked her how many crystals there were. But the main character said there wasn't one. She said it was just flowers. At that moment, Wilder was frightened. He asked the protagonist what she was doing. At that moment, the whole shop began to grow flowers. Wilder shouted to the girl to get her hands off of such colors now. The main character agreed and threw the bouquet on the ground. Wilder asked Karina what was wrong. He asked rather than she had been cursed by some mage or something. The main character said it never happened. After a while, the main character told me everything that happened yesterday, and then asked her why she hadn't told it before. Karina apologized and explained that she thought it would go away in a day or two. She said that, especially since they didn't have any plants in the shop, she thought it wouldn't be a problem. Said they'd been through this situation. He asked what it was about. The main character didn't understand what the man was talking about and apologized, saying that she shouldn't have used magic. But Wilder said he wasn't talking about her. He said to send flowers very unlike the Duke. The protagonist realized that Wilder meant the Duke. At this point, the main character told Wilder to leave the flowers because she would do the cleaning herself. But the man told her that she could sit still, because if she took the flowers again, they would grow even bigger. He said this effect should wear off in 3 days. Karina was glad to see that she was relieved. She asked her not to get close to the plants yet, right? Wilder said she could also take the opportunity to open her own flower shop. Karina said that was right. She said that if she had enough money, she would have already said goodbye to Artem and started her own business. Wilder chuckled and said he was glad to hear she didn't have that option yet. At this point, the main character asked the man if he had any guesses as to why this happened to her. Wilder said that a long time ago he had read about this phenomenon in a book on the theory of magic. He said that if what was written there was true, then the main character should not use magic for the rest of her life. Karina asked why. Wilder explained that every time she let her entrance in would produce something similar, but said she just wouldn't be able to control her power. He said that some people are born with great magical powers. He said that must have been why the magic crystal had reacted to her that day. Karina asked if even though she had great potential, even training could not help her to break control. But Octia said that he had never met a case like hers in any book. The main character realized that what she thought about last night was true. The main character realized that Renka had forbidden her to use magic because he considered it a threat. Wilder told the girl not to get upset because she still had the ability. Karina was upset and asked what was the point since she couldn't use them anyway. But Wilder said she could still benefit from her gift. He said she could sense the power of the magic stones. Wilder explained that it takes years of study and practice to learn how to determine whether the good or bad raw materials you have been given are good or bad. He said that the girl could discern them instinctively, and even the Duke recognized her talent. He explained that if she honed her skill, she could become the best magical salesman not only in the terrace, but in the entire empire. The main character said that people in this profession deal with magic crystals all the time. She asked what if she caused an explosion, but Wilder said it was rare. He said that if she studied hard and diligently, and it wouldn't be hard for her to minimize the risk. He said she would just have to hide her fears and trust that the magic crystal couldn't control her. Wilder also added that magic sellers make very good money. He said that the girl could buy her children anything they wanted and still have enough money left over. Karina was delighted and asked if he was telling the truth, but Wilder said that as soon as he mentioned children, the girl's eyes lit up. He said if the protagonist was interested in becoming a magical salesman, he'd help her with it. But not right now. He said she'd have to focus on the jewelry for now. He said he was tired after cleaning all those flowers and needed to take a break. The main character told the man to go rest, of course. She said he could leave the bench to her. This evening at Duke Thoros' estate, the Duke stood gazing dejectedly out of the window. At this point, the butler asked him if there was anything troubling him. Legs Duke said it was no big deal. He said he was just reflecting on his mistakes. The butler apologized but asked what he meant. He said the Duke could do nothing wrong that he could regret. This man's name is Lord Chichester. He is Chamberlain of this house. That moment he thanked the man but said he was afraid it was his fault. She said she couldn't believe his offer to Verla so many times, but he thought it was expected. But he didn't expect the main character to say no so flatly. So he sent her a formal invitation with flowers and his garden, but she completely ignored it. Chichester asked who this time. You gave me the name of the main character. She said she worked for Wilder. Chichester got angry and said he would never let her go. He also called Wilder an ungrateful old man. He said that Wilder was always very rude to his lordship, even realizing that he was only a commoner. But Thoros told Chichester that he knew perfectly well it wasn't so. He asked him to hate him, but Chichester said he would teach him a lesson one day. The Duke said he was sure the protagonist had refused her own will. Chichester told the Duke that then there must be a girl, and not have seen his face. He said there was no one who would answer his offer. He said that one day he would see how good he was. But at this point the Duke moved the man and said that sometimes he spoke to him as if he were a child. Chichester asked if that was true. He said it was probably because he knew him from the cradle. But the Duke told the man that his love for him had blinded him. At this point Chichester asked who the woman was. The Duke said she was from the north. Chichester asked if she wasn't from Tus. He asked what if she was here temporarily and then went to the capital. But Chichester looked at the Duke and realized that his face seemed to say, "Is this a problem?" Chichester tells Stas that he fears he must oppose their plans for the protagonist. He asked Herc if he'd forgotten. He said it had not been 2 months since Loda Tails had betrayed him and left him. But the Duke told the man to watch his tongue. Chiche tried to object and said that it was true. He said that after all the years in which the Duke had raised this simple servant to be a knight. Feet Duke interrupted the man and said that Tails had said that buying a house in the capital had been his long-held dream. But Chichester asked how many people wanted it. He said the Duke had trained many, and not all had gone to the capital. But Thoros told the man not to speak ill of those who had once been utterly devoted to him. Chichester told the Duke he was just being too generous. He said he's a commoner from the north who definitely wants to move to the capital. He told the Duke that he knows how it ends and the main character would be no exception. The Duke said that the protagonist didn't seem that ambitious. He said that she also has 2 children and asked if she would take risks in her position. But Chichester said that when people have money in their pockets, their thoughts often change. He asked Hertz why he wanted to take her in so badly. GK explained that the girl had an incredible talent for recognizing magic crystals. Also, the Duke wanted to say something, but he just smiled and remained silent. Chechete asked the Duke why he was silent, but he said it was nothing. He said he thought he should go and try again to convince her. Cheche asked how and what he was going to say. The Duke explained that he had a plan. He said that such a talent could not be passed up. After a while, the Duke came to the shop. He felt that this time he must persuade the protagonist. He realized that he also really needed people who could recognize magic crystals. The Duke realized that if word got out that there was a person in the city who knew about them, there would be knights gathered here who wanted to get a magic sword. This opportunity must be seized. At this point, the Crest agrees to the shop and the main character welcomed him as a regular customer. Duke took off his hood and narrated the protagonist said they hadn't seen in a while. Karina bowed her head and greeted Thoros properly, saying that Wilder would be in after lunch. She didn't understand why he had come. She wanted to see him as little as possible. But the Duke said he's not here for Wilder today. Karina asked, wondering if he was just checking out the neighborhood. Duke replied that it was true that he was involved in the development of Thoros. The main character asked if he's often out for checkups. Duke said that's true if you compare it to other cities. Karina said that's probably why it's a good place to live too. She said it was all thanks to the Duke's efforts. The Duke smiled and thanked the girl for her appraisal. There was an awkward silence after that. The main character didn't know what to say, and didn't understand why the Duke wasn't leaving. At that moment, the Duke told the protagonist that he would like to receive a reply to the invitation he had sent earlier. But Karina was surprised to ask what invitation. The Duke explained that he was talking about the one delivered here with the flowers. The protagonist didn't realize that those flowers were an invitation. She realized that she had ignored the Duke's invitation. The Duke said he sincerely hoped the main character would decide to stay in Tosa, said you appreciated her abilities and so asked her to serve him. But Toro said that it wasn't enough for the protagonist to haughtily reject his verbal offer. He asked the letter she also chose to ignore. He said he wouldn't stand for it. Karina tried to say it wasn't like that. The Duke asked shouldn't those who look down on him be punished. At this point, the protagonist asked the Duke to explain everything. She said the shop was a real mess that day and she didn't even see that he had sent the invitation. The Duke asked if it was true. The main character said it was the truth. She realized that the Duke seemed very angry. She remembered that it seemed that in the original story, the Duke had quite a temper. She thought that if he got angry here, Wilder's shop would be a pile of rubble. Thoris got excited and said that meant it was just a misunderstanding and she hadn't ignored his invitation. Karina said she would never do that. She thought it was strange because it was as if the guy had stopped being angry. The Duke asked the girl why she was apologizing then, as she had done nothing wrong. Karina realized that the more she looked at the Duke, the more it seemed to her that compared to the original story, the current Duke was a completely different person. And she thought maybe he had a personality disorder. Toro said he'd send another formal invitation then. The Duke said that if the protagonist didn't refuse, she could accept him. He said he still intends to have her. Nogi said that he should leave now as he had other things to do. And most importantly, the heroine agreed with him. But lastly, she wished him a good journey. Karina thought that since she had magical potential, the Duke wanted her to serve him. After all, according to him, she has a great talent. But she didn't understand why he said it that way because it made her very uncomfortable. At that moment, the door to the shop opened. Karina thought it was the Duke and asked if he had forgotten something, but it was a courier. He said he was making a parcel for Wilder and asked if everything was right. Karina said she did and started to walk over to pick up the parcel. The main character hoped that when she opened the box this time, nothing would happen. The parcel was from Sandaga, the first she'd heard of it. She surmised that they had started haggling for a new place. Karina thought it would be a good idea for her to tidy up the place. At this point, she began to open the parcel. Not far from the shop, the Duke pondered that the protagonist's talent is quite rare, and he would make her a servant of the House of Thors by any means necessary. At that moment, the Duke heard a strange sound and he wondered what it was. At that moment, he saw that some sort of barrier had appeared around Wilder's shop. Taurus was frightened because he realized what was there. He started running towards her with all his might. He realized that the protagonist was attacked when she was alone. The Duke bent upwards because he realized that every second counted and he had to hurry. At that moment, he threw magic stones into the air. Afterwards, they all turned into magic swords. With their help, the Duke broke the barrier. After that, he ran inside and asked the main character if she was okay. He asked if it was intact. He apologized to the girl for waiting so long, but he said he was here now, so she had nothing to worry about. After a while, the protagonist sat the Duke looking round the room. Karina realized that despite the situation, she was still a simple person, and she didn't understand if it was normal to sit when the Duke was standing. At this point, the Tauros asked the girl if she was okay. She smiled and said it was all right now. Asked now? He asked now means there was something before. Karina said she did. She explained that she had a bit of a heart condition. This is the moment Karina told me that Wilder had a parcel of sandin delivered. She said she opened it to check, but the protagonist said that when she first took the magic stone out of the box, she already realized that this crystal is far from unusual. She said that before she could even think about it, the whole building buckled, and her heart was pierced by an unbearable pain, as if a knife had been thrust into her chest. Karina said it wasn't like the last time the crystal exploded, and she didn't know what to do. But the girl said that then the pain suddenly disappeared and the Duke walked in. Taurus got angry and said he was a few seconds short. Karina asked the guy in no uncertain terms what happened and who was behind it. Duke said he's not sure but guesses who did it and why. He said that Wilder was probably their target, or rather no targeting him as a servant of the Duke. Karina asked if the Duke meant to say that someone was threatening him in this way. She asked what good it would do to make an enemy of him to the Duke. Taurus said the problem is much bigger than that, and it would be better to treat it as an attack on House Torres. The Duke said that the vast plains of Thoros are renowned for their fertility, hence the people who wish to take over his estates, and such men are innumerable. The Duke said it was not uncommon for them to do such things, and he should have warned the girl in advance. The Duke said he miscalculated, but the main character said it's okay because she's fine. The Duke told the girl that she said she had a heart condition, but Karina said it doesn't hurt anymore and everything is fine. The Duke explained that they'd left a mark on her heart. He said that although it would do no harm, the mage could find out where she was at any time through it. Karina was surprised and asked her how they knew they had marked her. They were Wilder. She said she didn't think they had threatened her. But Torres said it's not that easy to tag her. He said maybe these people know he's trying to win her over. He said there was a good chance it was her they wanted to get rid of. Karina didn't realize if she was in danger. That's when she told the Duke that there were people looking for her, but the guy told her that he couldn't say she was safe. Karina was very frightened and said it couldn't be. She said she could hurt the babies. She said she's a mom who should be protecting her children but is putting them in even more danger. Feet Duke told the girl that he would protect her and the children. Karina was surprised and asked what he meant. At this point, the guy suggested that the main character move into his estate. The Duke explained that there was no safer place in the city than the House of Thoris. Said many seek power, so his house has survived enough break-in attempts. But Karina said that sounded very unreassuring, and asked without thinking for so Duke. The guy smiled and said that he understood at least her thoughts, but he said that through these endeavors the walls of the manor became stronger, and the number of knights increased. He said he dares to say that the Imperial Palace has no such guards. He asked Karina if she had any desire to move into the Torres house. Karina realized she needed to think. She didn't realize if she moved to the Duke she would become a helpless servant who was tied to her house and master. She thought that if Roland was raised on the Duke's estate, he would notice that the boy was talented and had the potential to become an archmage, and everyone is going to try to get Roland by any means necessary. On the other hand, if they stayed in the hotel, the main character didn't know if they could feel free and happy. She didn't know if her babies would be comfortable. After all, she's not sure she can protect them from everything. Karina didn't realize that if they were actually attacked, they are extremely vulnerable in a hotel. Karina agreed. I told her she was up for it. But she asked Jacek if she could ask something. You asked what about? Karina asked that the Duke not ask her children to serve him. Therese interjected to offer to serve the children. At this point, he laughed. He said I'd noticed before that the girl's ideas were not unusual. I got embarrassed and asked him why he was laughing. The Duke said her children were too young. He said he likes talent, but he hasn't recruited kids this young yet. The Duke told the protagonist that all this time he had a feeling of Bhutan and was avoiding him. He asked if that was the reason. The main character remained silent but awkwardly looked away. The Duke said he was actually joking, but he asked if he'd really hit the mark. Karina realized that fortunately the Duke had no idea that Roland was capable of becoming an archmage. Thorez said he was in no hurry to lure people to his side. At that moment, the protagonist thought about it, but realized that if the Duke didn't want Roland's talent. At this point, she asked the Dukes why he was so good to her and the children. Duke asked if she hadn't realized yet. The Duke said it was his duty to protect the lives of the people of Torres. He said that as Duke of this land, he wanted to protect the people who live here. The next day after lunch, the main character told the children what had happened and said that they would stay at the Duke's estate for the time being. Melissa asked her mom if it was definitely necessary, but Karina said they were found by bad people, so they had to go somewhere safe. At that moment, Roland was scared out of his wits because he thought it was his uncle. But the main character tried to reassure the guy, said it wasn't him and it's okay. Karina said her uncle still hadn't shown up. At that moment, Melissa said she liked it here. She said she didn't want to go to another house. The main character hugged the girl and she said that she was happy here. But the main heroine explained that they are in a safe place and there is nothing to be afraid of. At this point, Tor told the children that his estate had lots of different goodies and the cook was a great cook. He bent the kids over and told them they would be whatever they wanted so they could agree. At this point, Melissa told Duke to be polite when asking for something. Well, at this point, the main character shut the girl's mouth and told her to think about what she was saying. Roland objected and said that the protagonist and they themselves had been taught that you should be polite when asking for something. At this point, Thorez told Karina that the children looked a lot like her. At this point, the protagonist turned to the boy his lordship. Melissa heard it and realized he was a duke. She said that means there's a princess in there too. Melissa walked over to Toe and asked if he was eating or not. The duke said there was a very beautiful princess. Melissa got very excited and asked if he was telling the truth. The Duke confirmed it. He said it was the Princess of the South and she would be very happy to meet her. Melissa got very excited and said that she really wanted to go then. Karina thought that this girl was the Duke's daughter. So he does have a wife. The main character realized that all this time the Duke had been helping her as a father raising a child. But at that moment, Karina wondered why she was upset and thought she needed to come to her senses. At this point, the protagonist asked Roland what he thought about it. She said that if he didn't want to go, they wouldn't go. But Roland smiled and said he liked a place where they could live safely. Torres asked, coming out, they all agree. The Duke told them to take their bags and go outside, for he had ordered a carriage to be brought in. A posh carriage was waiting for them outside. The Duke said it was a bit much. The heroine told him that at least the kids liked her. Roland and Melissa were very happy to be in Kareka because it was the first time they had ever ridden one. Karina said it was best not to touch the window frame. Roland wondered and asked why. Karina explained that there was just a lot of dust. The Duke turned to the protagonist and said she had a fiery look in her eyes. Karina explained that she used to work as a maid. I asked her before. The main character explained that it was before the wedding. The protagonist realized that she needed to watch her words. It was very easy for her to talk to the Duke, so she was losing control. At this point, Melissa told the protagonist to look because that's where the princess lived. Karina looked out the window and didn't realize if this was really the Duke's estate. She thought it wasn't a house, it was a palace. Then they stopped and the protagonist got out. She realized that they had really arrived. She also felt like she was entering a tiger's den. At this point, Roland turned to the main character and she asked what was wrong. The children were scared of the little puppy and told him to go away. There was a time when Roland was ordered by his uncle to kill a dog using a spell he'd learned. The main character ran up to Roth and asked if he was okay. She asked if he was in pain. Duke took the puppy in his arms and said it looked like the kids were scared of him. The main character realized that Roland must have remembered how Renka had trained him, making him kill puppies. Karina thought that his childhood traumas were at least somewhat healed. Karina told the guy not to worry because it's not the same puppy, and she said he had a little dot on his head. But Roland said the puppy was still scary. At this point, the Duke asked the protagonist if children are afraid of cats. Karina didn't understand why he suddenly asked about it. She said that they liked cats because they had a kitten living with them. Roland said he wanted to see the cats. The Duke told the children that if they went inside, there would be lots of cats. He told them to go in first. The Duke thought that the children had just been crying and now their eyes were shining. He thought they did look like their mum. He thought the kids were pretty cute. At that moment, Tor wondered who was cute. These thoughts even made him feel embarrassed. He didn't know what he was thinking. When the children went inside, they saw that a snow-white cat was sitting on the statue. Duke didn't understand why she was sitting there. He told Melissa that the cat's name was Daisy. Afterwards, they walked around the room and the Duke named all the cats. Karina realized that there really were a lot of cats. But the main heroine still could not understand whether it was the house of cats or the Duke. A little later, the Duke brought the protagonist to the house. He said she could live here now. Karina realized that, as she had thought, they would not be staying in the master's house. The Duke told them to come in. At that moment, the protagonist entered the house and was very surprised. She asked the Duke why he was giving them such a good place. She said they hardly deserved it. But Taurus said he was sorry he couldn't prepare anything better. Karina was surprised and told her that she didn't have to because they weren't worthy of it either. At this point, he told his mom that he really liked it here. Melissa said it was beautiful and everything was shiny. At this point, Thoreau told the main character that he wanted to show her something. He led her to a room where there was a huge amount of magical items. The main character saw the horns of a monster and thought it must be a very valuable thing. Afterwards, she noticed the scales of a mermaid. It is a forbidden magic ingredient that is very difficult to obtain. Torres said that this room was originally where his cousin had studied magic. It can be dangerous here, so it's best for children not to go in here. At this point, the main character asked the children if they had heard it. The children said yes and said yes. At this point, Karina wondered if as long as they were at the Duke's place, would she be able to treat Roland and Melissa like normal children. The protagonist thought the Duke hadn't noticed the little one's magical talent yet. She asked him why in this place. The Duke asked if she really didn't understand. He said he prepared all this just for her. The Duke asked well how she liked his gift. At this point, Karina became very embarrassed and asked again. Explained that he believes the main character will become a fine magician. He said she could choose any of the items she sees here. Karina looked away. She didn't understand why the Duke kept saying such embarrassing things. She thought she should say something. But Karina said she'd do it again. She said she couldn't use magic, but the Duke said he knows that. Karina said she wasn't going to become his servant either. The Duke said he remembered. Karina asked then why. Torres explained that it was because he was sorry to miss out on someone as talented as her. He said he'd help her develop her powers just enough that they could just get along. Karina was surprised and asked what benefit he had in it. The Duke said that as much as it thrills him to find gems that no one has ever seen before, such nurturing of skilled people makes him feel useful. He said that even if these men leave Taurus, they will do me good elsewhere and still remain his pride. For he knows somewhere out there they are still diligently pursuing their goals. The Duke said he might sound overconfident, but he said that when the protagonist became a great wizard, he was sure it would seem a good enough place for her to stay, because he's the one who will make it so. At that moment, the protagonist heard the children start calling for her. The Duke said it seemed to be hers. He suggested we go and have a look. Well, at that moment, he saw that the main character had already run away. Karina ran into the room and asked the kids what was wrong. Roland began to say that they were hungry and started looking for something to eat. Melissa said that a cat had suddenly appeared, but Roland said there was no cat here. Melissa started arguing with her brother and said that she had definitely seen a cat. But Roland asked her what kind of cat it was. He said it didn't look like one at all. Melissa said it was definitely a cat. She said that even though the eyes and fur were different, it was still a cat. Karina asked if it was a cat, but Roland said it was some kind of strange creature. Well, that's when Duke walked in and said Melissa was right and there's a cat in here. Melissa started to say she was right, but she said it didn't look like a cat at all. Duke said there was some truth to it. He said there were a lot of strange cats living here. The protagonist didn't realize if she was imagining things or if the Duke was trying to dispel their suspicions. She realized he was talking about cats, but this was something else entirely. She knew the Duke didn't want to tell the truth about this creature. At that moment, Melissa's stomach rumbled. Karina came up to the girl and said that she was very hungry. She said she would cook something now, but the Duke said he would call the cook. Karina tried to tell me that there was no need to call me any cook and she would cook herself, but the Duke said that as long as they live in a place, no. He said a teacher was coming to see the children today. Karina thanked the Duke for doing so much for them, but Thoreau said that on their estate this man was the best at teaching. He said he taught the best student in the empire. The main character thought that if the children were taught by such a talented person, he could discover their talent, and in that case their happy life. Karina asked the Duke if he was talking about the mentor of the princess in the south. The Duke confirmed it. Karina asked if it would be all right to see his daughter. Herzen was surprised and asked his daughter, "Is the main character really talking about Astrid?" He explained that she was not his daughter. Karina asked then someone the princess of the south to whom he had spoken. Childhood told me it was his little sister. He said that as long as the joint sessions are like that, it's fine. But the main character said no, because even if she is his little sister, the lady still knows. She asked how her children could study with her, but the Duke said he'd promised them a better teacher. He said he kept his word. He asked Karina if she wanted to make him look like a liar. Karina objected and said she didn't mean it. She asked if it was okay for her to take these classes. Hersheg smiled and said of course. At that moment, he asked Karina how old her firstborn son was. Karina said he was 8. The Duke said that Astrid is 4 years older. He said the age difference is significant, and it would be difficult to study together. Karina thought that if Roland was 8, then the Duke's sister was 12. She did the math and realized they were 15 years apart. The GK said they'll start classes tomorrow. Asked the protagonist she doesn't want to delay the education of her own children. The main character said no, but she said that even if they don't rush, it's okay. Legs Duke said it's okay and he's taking his time. At that moment he rang the bell and said to call for the Thérèse. At that moment there was a knock on the room. It was Thérèse. She said she heard him calling her. That's when the girl entered the room and greeted the main character. At this point she asked the Duke she wouldn't have to teach these children, would she? But Tora said she's a quick learner. He said separate classes with Astrid. But the Thérèse said she's refusing. Hercheg asked permission to know the reason. Karina thought that of course it was because she didn't want to teach the children of commoners, whom she was seeing for the first time. The main character hugged the kids and said it was okay. Thérèse guessed that it's hard for her to even teach one. There's 2 of them. The Duke asked what that meant. He asked if he had been slacking off lately. Thérèse said it wasn't like that. She said things were going well enough. The Duke then asked what the problem was. Thérèse asked just to hear her out. She said that the princess had been receiving an education lately, but one that exceeded in depth and complexity the programs of all other children of her age. And now she is so good at everything that even she barely has the energy to keep up with the curriculum. Thérèse asked when she has such a responsibility on her shoulders, if she can squander it on someone else. She said that in a situation like this, when there are 3 children, 3 different people have to do the teaching. Thérèse said that moreover she had never taught young children. She said it would take longer to prepare the lesson. She said that in Ufa, if she took over the care of these 2, it would affect the princess's education. The Duke said he understood. He said he really shouldn't harm the training in Astrid. The Duke said the girl is giving her life to teach others, so she knows best and can go. After that she left. Duke said he was sorry. He said she was going to another teacher as soon as possible. Karina told him to take his time because it wasn't urgent. Karina told GSG that his little sister seems to be doing great in school. The Duke said she was a good student and a good little sister. This is the moment the protagonist thought the guy had a really weird facial expression. The Duke said he was in a hurry to make the arrangements, so he hadn't considered all the details. He suggested that we go inside and have dinner together. Karina asked if he was inviting them all to dinner. The Duke told the girl that he had invited her to the mansion not as an employee, but as a guest. He asked if they could have lunch together. The Duke told Karina that she shouldn't think she'd trade him in with this. He said they were having an unofficial banquet, but a casual, you might say, family dinner. Later at the table, the Duke said he hadn't had lunch with anyone in a long time. Karina asked what about his sister, but the Duke said she didn't like him. Karina was surprised. She thought they had a bad relationship. Karina looked at the children and thought it would be better to get everyone together. At this point, the Duke said that the children knew the rules of behavior at the table. He said that they were well-mannered and calm. He said that the main character had raised them excellently. Karina thanked him. She remembered that she herself had said her husband was dead. Karina told the Duke that their father had raised them well. The Duke asked if he was an aristocrat, but the main character said that in no way. At this point, the Duke apologized if he had upset the protagonist. He said that her children seemed to him to be educated by their peers. Karina didn't understand if he doubted the stories she had made up for him. The main character said her husband was a traitor. The Duke said that since it was so, they must have some fortune left. But he asked then what had made them look for a new house. At this point, Melissa told the Duke that their uncle was very bad. Roland added that their uncle took all their money and abandoned them.